So we're going to finish off this unit looking at the international debt crisis. Debt. Get ready for it. So what is debt exactly? That's money that you owe. And it can be a personal debt that you'll have probably some point in your life, or government debt. So our governments, our countries can be in debt to other countries. And so we see a huge debt, for example, this is a good one for Africa in terms of debt to countries. Like we talked about in the previous lecture when we looked at the deficiencies in wealth equality. So the burden of the international debt. So old core countries have huge amounts of debt. The US is at the top of the list. They choose to borrow from outside the country because it is cheaper. The exchange rate is usually better. Loans help the economy. They're taken to pay for things. The economies go strong. They can afford the interest and principal costs, so the debt does not grow generally, although a lot of countries are in huge debt right now because of the COVID. So the U.S. is right at the top of that list. The U.S. owes huge amounts of debt, a lot of it to China, interestingly enough. So if you look here, this is kind of the national debt by country, the total percent of GDP, and this is all in U.S. dollars. So Canada was about 62.3. If you notice the U.S., it is 8.68 trillion. We're only in the billions, billion, trillion. India's trillion, Japan is in the trillions, Germany's in the trillions, UK is in the trillions, France in the trillions. We're only in the billions. We don't have a huge population. Periphery countries are not in the same situation. Their economies have not grown as quickly as the core countries. So debts keep increasing, cost to pay the debt keeps rising for them. So the interest rates on these debts. Now, when I say interest rates, and I didn't really explain that for those of you who are not taking business courses or economic courses, what is interest? So when you borrow money from somewhere, you have to pay back that money, but you also have to pay interest on top of it. So, for example, for every $1, every $1.50, make it easy, that you pay back to your debt, only 75 cents of that goes to the pay back the debt. The other 75 cents goes to paying the interest rate. So it's hard to get ahead and that sort of thing. So the 2.9 trillion is the cost of the debt for periphery countries, and then 513 billion is the cost. Keeps rising. So banks and other lenders treat some regions as safer than others when it comes to international debt. So the developing world's debt, so the World Bank, bilateral loans, private loans. The World Bank will give more money to not in terms of, and then where the debt comes from. So you notice most of it is coming from East Asia and Latin America. And then we have the Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, because they're not giving money to them. That's why there's not so much debt there. Okay, so if you look here at the debt ratio, you'll notice a trend among the countries, mostly in Africa. There's a tremendous amount of debt. So how did this happen? How did this all happen? So in 1957, most governments simply gave aid in the form of grants, and a grant is free money. So you get the grant, you don't have to pay it back. A loan, you have to pay back. The U.S. switched from grants to loans, so now you have to pay it back because they wanted to make money on the interest of it. And then other governments did the same thing because they thought this is a great idea, let's make some money on this. So poor countries needed to accept these loans if they wanted the money, but they also have to pay back the money. So it's a vicious cycle of instead of grants, you have to pay back these loans. In 73, oil price, we had what we call the oil crisis in Canada. The US dollar got so high at that time that OPEC, which was the union of oil, and the majority of oil comes from the Middle East. And so what they did is they raised the price of oil by 70%, which is huge influx of oil. And a lot of the old, in the 70s, of course, people had gas guzzling cars. We still have gas guzzling cars, but they had a lot more gas guzzling cars, and these cars were, there wasn't enough oil, and people were lined up for days to get this oil. So this ended up inconveniencing a lot of rich countries, but poor countries are completely ruined because they didn't have the oil to run the economy, because a lot of it runs on the economy. So because OPEC increased their prices, they made a huge amount of money in the early 1970s. They invested this money throughout the developing world, and this meant the banks had money to lend. There was a lot of cheap money to be loaned, and so the developed countries were very interested. The interest rates were floating. They kept changing with the market, and loans were used for needs like oil, and this vicious cycle. And that contributed. And this is what we call petrodollars. So just to reiterate, because that's a lot of information. So OPEC, which sets the price of the oil, raised the price of the oil by 70%. People still needed the oil, so they had to buy it. So they got very rich. So then they took this money and they put it into banks in the developing and developed world. And then people who were borrowing money from these banks, which were basically from the people who were paying for the oil, were using the money they borrowed to buy oil. And this is why it's called petrodollars. So it's just kind of this round and round and round because they needed the oil. So it's not right. Like, it's not fair at all, but none of this is fair economic. So during the 70s and 80s, the world economy experienced very high rates of inflation. So that means when the price of things go way up. And this meant a loan rate of 5% in the 1970s could be as high as 15% in the 1980s. So that's kind of where, and it just depends on the situation at the time. I can use a real life example for you here right now. I recently sold my house, and where I live, the cost of houses has gone way up, because of the COVID. Because right now people want to move out of the city, and where I live is about an hour from Ottawa and an hour from Kingston. So people who will now be working from home want to move out of the city because after COVID, they realized that it's not really fun to live in the city when you can't do anything in the city. So they prefer to be outside and away from other places. So that's part of it as well. So that's kind of a real life example of where this is. So most poor countries need to export goods so they can get hard currencies. Because if you're exporting goods, you're making money. That's real money. If the prices of commodities falls, they receive less money to pay off their loans. So this becomes a problem because they need the money to pay it off. Agricultural products, forestry products, mining products, but they decreased during the 70s and 80s because you have that period of decolonization, and you have people who are not needing this stuff anymore, either because they can't afford it or for various other reasons. Okay, that is it. I've had enough of economics. I hope you have had enough of economics too. And that is it for this unit. That is the final one. Okay, I'm done with that. We're done with debt. Well, you're not done with that debt. You're never done with debt. At some point in your life, you are going to be in debt. So stay young. Stay as young as you can, as long as you can. All right, guys, that's it for this unit, and we will see you in the next.